The morning light filtered through the worn curtains of the Miller household, casting long shadows across the living room. It was an anniversary of sorts, though not one they celebrated. 10 years since Ethan disappeared, a decade of silence, uncertainty, and pain. John sat at the small kitchen table, staring at a framed photograph of Ethan, taken just months before everything changed. His son's mischievous smile stared back at him, an innocent joy that now felt so distant it was like a ghost haunting him. Cassy entered the room quietly, her footsteps soft, barely disturbing the air. She found John sitting there, shoulders hunched and face weathered by the years of searching. Her own heart ached just looking at him. She walked over to the counter, pouring 2 cups of coffee, and moved to join him by the table. They sat in silence for a moment, each lost in their thoughts. Finally, John spoke, his voice gruff. "I think I've found something," he said without turning to face her, his eyes still fixed on the photograph. Cassie's hand stilled, her grip on her cup tightening. "John," she said, her tone a mixture of caution and weariness. She didn't want to hear it. Not today. Not when the emptiness seemed so vast. But she knew she couldn't stop him. She never could. "It's different this time," John insisted, finally turning to look at her, his eyes full of a hope that was almost painful to see. A photo came in the mail, a boy, a scar just like Ethan's. Cassy looked away, staring into her coffee. "We've had pictures before," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Leads, trails that went nowhere." Each false hope had chipped away at her, leaving her hollow, fragile. She feared what would happen if they came up empty-handed again. John reached across the table, covering her hand with his. "I know, Cass. But I can't stop. I can't let this go." She nodded slowly, her heart aching for him and for herself. "I know you can't," she whispered, and in that moment, she decided she couldn't either. If there was even the slightest chance that the boy in the photograph was their Ethan, they had to follow it wherever it led them. After a moment of stillness, Cassy rose from her seat, heading upstairs to Ethan's room. She opened the door quietly, letting her gaze fall on the untouched space. The small twin bed was neatly made, covered in a superhero-themed quilt that Ethan had adored. His shelves were still filled with his books and toys, each one a memory of the child he had been. Cassy walked over to the dresser, her fingers brushing against a stuffed bear, Ethan's favorite. She picked it up, holding it close to her chest, her eyes closing against the wave of emotion that overwhelmed her. She could still see him in her mind, lying in bed, his small face peeking out from under the covers as she read him a bedtime story. She could hear his laughter, his questions, his innocent curiosity. She opened her eyes, blinking back tears. They had to follow this lead. It might be another dead end, but it could also be the path that brought their boy back home. That afternoon, John descended the narrow stairs into the basement, a space that had become his makeshift office over the years. The walls were lined with corkboards covered in photographs, notes, and maps. He had spent countless hours down here, combing through every detail, every piece of information he could gather. He sat at the cluttered desk, pulling out the photograph he had received. A grainy image of a teenage boy stared back at him. The scar beneath his left eye was faint, but it was there, unmistakable. John's heart pounded in his chest as he heard footsteps behind him. Cassy joined him, her eyes lingering on the mess around them before landing on the photograph in John's hand. "That's him," John said quietly, showing her the photo. Cassy leaned over, studying the image. Her heart skipped a beat. The resemblance was uncanny, the scar, the shape of his face. But after all these years, she was hesitant to trust her eyes, hesitant to let herself hope. "Maybe," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "But John, if it's not." "I know," he replied, his voice filled with the pain they both felt. "But what if it is?" Cassy took a deep breath, nodding. "Then we have to find out." The next morning, John and Cassy set out, driving through winding roads, heading toward a town that felt like it was in the middle of nowhere. Pine Hollow, a name that seemed to echo with secrets, with the kind of mystery that made her stomach churn. The landscape around them was bathed in a misty grey, the trees lining the road appearing almost like shadows. Cassy looked over at John, his jaw set, his hands gripping the wheel tightly. She knew what this meant to him, what it meant to both of them. "John, you know this might not end the way we want," she said cautiously, her voice soft. He nodded, though he didn't look at her. "I know, but I need to try." They drove in silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. The road eventually led them into Pine Hollow, a town that seemed almost forgotten by time. A small gas station came into view, and John pulled over, stepping out of the car to approach the attendant. Cassy stayed in the car, watching as John spoke, showing the photograph around. She could see the attendant's wary eyes, the way he glanced around as if he feared being watched. After a moment, John returned to the car, a mix of hope and anxiety etched across his face. "He knows something," John said, his voice low. "He gave me directions to a farmhouse on the outskirts of town." Cassy's stomach twisted in knots. There was something about this place that filled her with dread, a sense that they were stepping into something far darker than they could imagine. But she pushed those fears aside, determined to follow through, to support John in whatever came next. They parked the car on a dirt path, the farmhouse just barely visible in the distance. They decided to walk the rest of the way, wanting to remain unnoticed. As they approached, they saw a group of teenagers playing in the yard. Cassy's breath caught in her throat as her eyes landed on one of them, a boy, slightly taller than the others, with dark hair and a scar beneath his left eye. John stopped, his eyes locked on the boy. His heart pounded in his chest as he took a step forward. But Cassy grabbed his arm, holding him back. "What if it's not him?" she whispered, her voice trembling. She could see the desperation in John's eyes, the hope that threatened to break them both. John swallowed hard, his eyes still on the boy. He wanted to run, to grab him, to finally end this nightmare. But Cassy's hand on his arm held him back, grounding him. They had to be careful. They couldn't afford to make a mistake, not now, not when they were so close. The chapter ended with them standing there, frozen in that moment, caught between hope and fear, between the past and the future. The boy in the yard laughed, his voice carrying across the field, and for the first time in years, Cassy allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, they were finally close to bringing Ethan home. The afternoon sun hung low, casting a dim glow over the farmstead as John and Cassy stood frozen on the dirt path, staring at the boy in the yard. His laughter rang across the field, so familiar yet so foreign, bringing with it a wave of bittersweet memories. Cassy tightened her grip on John's arm, her fingers digging into his jacket as she watched the boy run around with the other teenagers, carefree and unburdened by the weight of the years that had shattered their lives. "John, we can't just rush in," she whispered, her voice trembling. "We need to be sure." John nodded, but his eyes never left the boy. There was a desperation in his gaze, a need that had been festering for nearly a decade. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself, and after a long moment, He nodded again, this time more resolutely. We'll be careful, he promised, his voice strained. But we can't walk away. Not now. They took a cautious step forward, their feet crunching on the dry earth, drawing the attention of one of the teenagers. The girl's eyes widened slightly, and she quickly whispered something to the boy Ethan. If it truly was him who immediately turned, his expression changing from laughter to confusion and then something that bordered on fear. Without warning, the boy bolted, running toward the thick woods that bordered the property. John let out a strangled sound, torn between instinct and reason, his body half turning to chase. Ethan, he called, his voice hoarse, filled with hope and panic. Cassy grabbed his arm more firmly, her eyes wide with fear. John, wait, she said urgently. We don't even know if it's really him. If you scare him, he'll never come back. Her words hung in the air, a harsh reminder of the delicate situation they were in. John hesitated, his gaze locked on the boy's disappearing figure as he vanished into the tree line. He clenched his jaw, his fists tightening in helpless frustration. We can't just let him go, he said, his voice breaking. I know, Cassy said softly, her own heart aching. She took a deep breath, trying to think clearly. We need to do this right. We need to be patient, John. If it's really Ethan, we'll find him. John stared at her for a long moment, then nodded, though his entire posture was tense, every muscle in his body resisting the idea of waiting. But he knew she was right. They couldn't afford to make a mistake, not now. Not when they were so close. He looked back at the woods, his heart pounding. We need to find another way, he said, his voice a mixture of determination and helplessness. They turned back toward the farmhouse, their eyes scanning the property for any signs of movement. The other teenagers had retreated into the house, and now the yard was empty, eerily silent. Cassy noticed the door of the farmhouse slightly ajar, a shadow moving behind it. Someone was watching them, and it sent a shiver down her spine. She nudged John, nodding toward the house. John frowned, his eyes narrowing. Someone's there, he whispered. He started toward the farmhouse, but Cassy held him back again, shaking her head. Not yet, she said, her voice firm. We need to regroup. We don't know what's going on here, John. We need to be smart about this. John took a deep breath, forcing himself to step back to listen. He nodded, though every fibre of his being was screaming at him to move forward, to run after his son. Okay, he said, his voice tight. We go back to town. We figure out our next move. The drive back to Pine Hollow was tense, the silence between them heavy with unspoken fears and hopes. Cassy kept glancing at John, his face set in a grim expression, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. She knew what he was feeling, she felt it too. The hope that had been reignited, fragile and terrifying. The fear that they were wrong, that they were chasing a ghost. As they pulled into the small motel parking lot, John finally spoke, his voice low and pained. What if we lose him again, Cassy? He turned to look at her, his eyes filled with the weight of 10 years of searching, of longing. I don't think I can take that. Cassy reached across the console, taking his hand in hers. She squeezed gently, her own eyes shining with unshed tears. We won't lose him, she said, her voice trembling but filled with conviction. If that's Ethan, we'll find him. We'll bring him home. John looked at her for a long moment, then nodded slowly, drawing in a shaky breath. We need a plan, he said, his voice steadier now. We need to find out who's at that farmhouse, who those kids are. Cassy nodded, her mind already racing with possibilities. We could go back to the gas station, she suggested. The attendant seemed to know something. Maybe he can tell us more. John hesitated, then nodded. It's a start, he agreed. He turned off the car, glancing at the motel. But first, we rest. We need to be ready for whatever comes next. They checked into a small, dingy room, the walls yellowed with age, the bed sagging in the middle. It wasn't much, but it didn't matter. They weren't here for comfort. They were here to find their son. Cassy sat on the edge of the bed, her hands trembling slightly as she thought of the boy in the yard, of his laughter, his fear when he saw them. She closed her eyes, taking a deep breath, trying to steady herself. They were closer than they had been in years. They just had to hold on a little longer. The next morning, they returned to the gas station, there thick with anticipation. The attendant eyed them warily as they approached, his posture stiffening as John showed him the photograph once again. You said you recognized him, John said, his voice calm but insistent. Please, we need to know who he is. The attendant shifted uncomfortably, glancing around as if to make sure no one was watching. He leaned in closer, his voice barely a whisper. You shouldn't be here, he said, his eyes darting nervously toward the road. Those people at the farmhouse, they're not the kind you want to mess with. John's heart pounded in his chest, but he kept his voice steady. That boy might be our son, he said, his eyes locking onto the attendant's. Please, anything you know could help us. The attendant hesitated, then sighed, his shoulders slumping. They call him Ryan, he said quietly. He's been with them for a few years now. But it's not right, what they're doing out there. People come and go, strange folks. It's not safe. Cassy felt a chill run down her spine, her stomach churning with fear. What do you mean? She asked, her voice trembling. The attendant shook his head, stepping back. I've said too much already, just... Be careful. If you're smart, you'll leave this place and never look back. He turned away, disappearing into the small convenience store attached to the gas station, leaving John and Cassy standing there, their hearts heavy with a mixture of dread and hope. John turned to Cassy, his eyes filled with determination. We're not leaving, he said firmly. If that's Ethan, we're not giving up. No matter what it takes, Cassy nodded, her heart pounding. She knew the risks, knew the danger they might be walking into. But she also knew they had come too far to turn back now. They had to see this through, for Ethan, for the family they had lost and the one they hoped to rebuild. Together, they returned to their car, the road ahead uncertain, filled with shadows and secrets. But for the first time in years, they had a direction, a lead that felt real. They had hope, and they would follow it wherever it led them. The motel room was dim and quiet, the only sound the rhythmic hum of the air conditioner in the corner. John sat on the edge of the bed, his head in his hands, staring down at the faded carpet. His heart felt heavy, and he could feel the weight of the last decade pressing on his shoulders, his entire body aching with exhaustion and frustration. Cassy sat beside him, her hand resting gently on his back, her fingers tracing small, comforting circles as they tried to process what the gas station attendant had told them. The name Ryan echoed in John's mind, a foreign sound that was now intertwined with the memory of his son. He couldn't help but wonder if Ethan had ever spoken that name, if he had said it with the same confusion and uncertainty that he now felt. The idea that his son could have been living with strangers, unaware of who he truly was, made John's chest tighten painfully. It was as though the years that had already slipped away were slipping even further, becoming more elusive, out of reach. "John," Cassy whispered, her voice breaking the silence between them. She leaned closer, resting her head on his shoulder. "We need to figure out what to do next. We can't just sit here." John lifted his head, his eyes red and weary. He turned to face her, his expression filled with determination. "We need to go back," he said, his voice resolute. "We need to find a way into that farmhouse. If Ethan is there, we can't leave without him." Cassy hesitated, her brow furrowing with worry. She had seen the fear in the attendants' eyes, heard the warnings he had given them. But as she looked into John's face, she saw that same unyielding fire that had kept him going for the last 9 years. It was a fire she couldn't extinguish, even if she wanted to. And she knew she didn't want to. They had come too far to turn back now. "Okay," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She took a deep breath, steeling herself. "But we have to be smart about it. We can't just go in without a plan. We need to understand who's there and what we're up against." John nodded, his eyes never leaving hers. He knew she was right. They couldn't afford to make mistakes, not with the stakes this high. He reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "We'll find a way," he said softly. Together. Night fell over Pine Hollow, casting the small town in deep shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly into the darkness. John and Cassy parked their car a few blocks away from the farmhouse, the engine ticking softly as it cooled. They stepped out into the cool night air, the distant sound of crickets filling the silence. They moved quietly, staying in the shadows as they made their way along the winding dirt path that led to the farmhouse. The place was dark, the windows shuttered, and the only light came from a small lamp hanging above the front door. Cassy could feel her heart pounding in her chest, her palms sweaty as she followed John, their footsteps nearly silent on the ground. They reached a spot where they could see the farmhouse clearly, but remained hidden behind a line of thick shrubs. John scanned the area, his eyes narrowing as he noticed a figure standing by the side of the house, a guard, his posture alert. Cassy swallowed hard, her nerves on edge. This wasn't just a simple farmhouse. There was something much more sinister going on here, and they were stepping straight into the unknown. John turned to her, his face tense. He motioned for her to stay put while he inched forward, hoping to get a better view. Cassy nodded, her hands trembling as she crouched down behind the shrubs, watching as he moved closer, his body almost blending into the shadows. Suddenly, there was movement to her left. Cassy turned her head sharply, her eyes widening as she saw a young girl standing a few feet away, her face half hidden by the darkness. Cassy's breath caught in her throat as the girl stepped closer, her eyes wide and filled with a mix of fear and urgency. "You shouldn't be here," the girl whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of the crickets. Cassy blinked, her heart skipping a beat as she stared at the girl. She looked young, maybe 14 or 15. Her hair pulled back into a loose braid, her clothes worn and dirty. "Who are you?" Cassy whispered, her voice trembling. The girl glanced around nervously, her eyes darting toward the farmhouse before looking back at Cassy. "My name's Lily," she said quickly. "I know who you're looking for." "The boy Ryan. I can help you, but we have to hurry." Cassy's eyes widened, her heart pounding in her ears. "You know him?" she asked, her voice filled with a mix of hope and fear. Lily nodded, her expression serious. "He's inside. They keep him locked up most of the time, but I know where they take him. If you want to help him, we have to go now." Cassy looked over her shoulder, her eyes searching for John. He was still focused on the guard, unaware of what was happening. She turned back to Lily, her mind racing. This was the lead they needed, but it was happening so fast. She hesitated, then reached for Lily's hand, her grip firm. Okay. Let's get John, and we'll do this. Lily shook her head, pulling her hand away. No, there's no time, she insisted, her voice urgent. If they see us, they'll move him, and you'll lose him for good. We have to go now, before the guards change shifts. Cassy hesitated, her heart in her throat. She knew the risk, knew what this could mean if they were caught. But then she thought of Ethan, of his laughter, his small hand in hers, his eyes filled with innocence. She couldn't lose him again. She nodded, her decision made. Lead the way, she said, her voice trembling but resolute. Lily turned, leading Cassy away from the shrubs and toward the back of the farmhouse. They moved quickly, their footsteps silent, the shadows of the night enveloping them. Cassy's heart raced, fear and hope intertwining as they approached the back entrance, a small door that Lily carefully pushed open, revealing a dark hallway beyond. They slipped inside, the air cool and stale, the smell of damp wood filling Cassy's nostrils. Lily led her down the hallway, their steps careful and quiet, every creak of the floorboards making Cassy's pulse spike. They reached a door at the end of the hall, and Lily turned to her, her eyes serious. He's in here, she whispered, her hand resting on the doorknob. She looked at Cassy, her eyes filled with something that looked like sympathy. But he might not remember you. They've done things to him. He's not the same. Cassy swallowed hard, her heart aching. She nodded, her eyes shining with unshed tears. I have to try, she whispered, her voice breaking. He's my son. Lily nodded, then slowly turned the knob, the door creaking open. Cassy stepped inside, her breath catching as her eyes fell on the figure in the corner, a boy, his back to her, his shoulders hunched as he sat on a small cot. Her heart ached at the sight of him, at the familiarity of his form. Ethan, she whispered, her voice barely audible. The boy stiffened, his head turning slightly, just enough for Cassy to see the scar beneath his left eye. Her breath caught, tears spilling down her cheeks. Ethan, it's me, it's MOM. The boy turned fully then, his eyes wide and filled with confusion, fear etched across his features. He looked at her, his gaze searching her face, and for a moment there was a flicker of recognition, something that made Cassy's heart swell with hope. But then it was gone, replaced by a guarded, distant look. Who are you? He asked, his voice rough, uncertain. Why are you here? Cassy took a step forward, her hands trembling as she reached for him. I'm your mother, Ethan, she said, her voice cracking. I've been looking for you for so long. The boy Ryan shook his head, his eyes narrowing. No, he whispered, his voice filled with doubt. My name is Ryan. I don't know you. Cassy's heart broke at his words, at the emptiness in his eyes. She knelt before him, her hands shaking as she reached out, her fingers barely grazing his arm. Please, she whispered, her tears falling freely. I know you don't remember me, but I'm here. I'm here to take you home. Ryan stared at her, his expression wavering, something flickering behind his eyes, fear, hope, confusion. He didn't move, didn't say anything, and Cassy's heart ached with the weight of the years they had lost, the time that had slipped away from them. She knew it wouldn't be easy, that the road ahead was filled with uncertainty, that as she looked at her son, she knew she couldn't give up. Not now, not ever. Please, Ethan, she whispered again, her voice filled with all the love and longing of the years they had been apart. Come home. John's heart pounded as he watched Cassy and the young girl, Lily, slip out of sight around the back of the farmhouse. He had seen them exchange hurried words, but he hadn't caught what they were saying. Now, Cassy was gone, and John's entire body tensed with fear. He didn't know what she was doing or why she had decided to move without him, but he knew he had to be ready. He stayed low, his eyes trained on the farmhouse, ready to move at a moment's notice. Minutes felt like hours as he waited, his heart in his throat. Every sound, the rustle of the leaves, the distant chirp of a cricket seemed amplified in the silence of the night. The guard by the side of the house shifted his position, turning his back momentarily, and John took that chance to move closer, keeping himself hidden behind the thick shrubs. He felt a pit in his stomach, a sense of helplessness that gnawed at him. He had always been the one to lead the charge, to make the decisions, but now Cassy had taken that role. He trusted her, but the fear of losing her, of losing Ethan again, made every nerve in his body scream for action. Suddenly, a creak echoed through the stillness. John's head whipped round, his eyes narrowing as he caught sight of a door opening at the back of the farmhouse. He could see Cassy and Lily emerging, and in front of them, a figure taller, with dark hair, his movements hesitant and unsure. John's heart skipped a beat. It was Ethan. John's breath caught, his emotions a tumultuous mix of hope, fear, and overwhelming love. He wanted to call out, to run to them, but he knew he couldn't risk drawing attention. Instead, he moved closer, staying just out of sight, his eyes locked on his son. He could see Ethan's face, now older, different, but still undeniably his. The scar beneath his left eye caught the faint glow of the moonlight, and John felt a pang of both joy and grief at the sight. This was his son, but there was a distance in his eyes, a look of confusion that tore at John's heart. As they made their way across the yard, Lily leading the way, John noticed movement near the side of the house. The guard had turned, his eyes narrowing as he spotted the group. John's heart leaped into his throat, and without thinking, he surged forward, his feet pounding against the earth. "Hey!" the guard shouted, his voice echoing across the quiet night. Cassy's head whipped around, her eyes widening in fear as she saw the guard approaching. She grabbed Ethan's hand, pulling him forward, her voice urgent. "Run, Ethan!" "We have to go," but Ethan hesitated, his eyes wide and filled with confusion. "I don't understand," he muttered, his feet seemingly frozen in place. Cassy pulled harder, her voice cracking as she pleaded with him. "Please, Ethan, just trust me." John reached them just as the guard did, his body colliding with the man's, knocking him off balance. They both hit the ground, the force of the impact jarring through John's bones. He struggled against the guard, his fists connecting with whatever part of the man he could reach, his only thought to protect his family. The guard fought back, landing a punch to John's side, but John ignored the pain, his determination overpowering everything else. "Go!" John shouted, his voice strained as he struggled to keep the guard pinned. "Cassy, take Ethan and go." Cassy hesitated for only a moment before she nodded, her grip on Ethan tightening. She pulled him along, Lily following close behind, their footsteps echoing as they ran toward the road. John watched them for a split second, relief washing over him as he saw them disappear into the darkness. Then he turned his full attention back to the guard beneath him, his face twisted in anger. The guard struggled, trying to push John off, but John held firm, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. He had to buy them time to get away, to find safety. He gritted his teeth, his muscles straining as he fought to keep the guard down. But then, out of the corner of his eye, John saw movement, another figure approaching from the farmhouse, a flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. His heart sank. He couldn't hold them both off. He had to get out of there, had to find Cassy and Ethan. With a final, forceful shove, John pushed himself off the guard, scrambling to his feet. He took off in the direction Cassy had gone, his legs pumping as he ran, his lungs burning with each breath. He could hear the guards behind him, their shouts growing fainter as he pushed himself harder, the only thought in his mind to reach his family. Cassy's heart pounded as she ran, her hand tightly gripping Ethan's. She could feel his hesitation, the confusion radiating off him, but she didn't dare stop. They had to get away, had to find safety before it was too late. Lily led the way, her movements quick and sure, guiding them through the darkened woods that bordered the farmhouse. "Where are we going?" Ethan asked, his voice breathless, fear evident in his tone. "Someplace safe," Cassy replied, her voice cracking. She glanced at him, her eyes filled with both love and pain. "I promise, Ethan. I'm your mother. I'm here to protect you." Ethan's eyes met hers for a brief moment, something flickering behind his gaze, recognition, perhaps, or just a sliver of trust. It was enough to keep Cassy going, enough to give her hope that maybe, just maybe, they could find a way through this. They reached the edge of the woods, the road just visible beyond the trees. Lily paused, her eyes scanning the area before she motioned for them to follow. "The car's just up ahead," she whispered. "We have to move fast." Cassy nodded, her grip on Ethan tightening as they made their way toward the road. She could see the car now, parked just a few yards away, the sight of it filling her with a sense of urgency. They were so close. But then, a shout echoed through the night, one of the guards, his voice carrying through the darkness. Cassy's heart leaped into her throat, her body tensing as she pushed Ethan forward. "Go," she urged, her voice filled with panic. "Get in the car." Ethan hesitated, his eyes wide with fear, but then he moved, his feet pounding against the ground as he ran toward the car. Lily followed, her movements quick and sure, while Cassy stayed back, her eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of John. She saw him then, his figure emerging from the shadows, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps as he ran toward them. Relief flooded through her, and she waved frantically. "John, over here." John's eyes locked onto hers, and he pushed himself harder, his legs burning as he closed the distance between them. He reached her just as the guards emerged from the woods, their flashlights sweeping across the road. Without hesitation, John grabbed Cassie's hand, pulling her toward the car. They reached it just as Ethan and Lily climbed inside, and John threw open the driver's door, his voice urgent. "Get in!" Cassy didn't hesitate, sliding into the passenger seat as John started the engine, the car roaring to life. He slammed his foot on the gas, the tires screeching as they sped away, the guard shouts fading into the distance. For a long moment, the only sound was the roar of the engine, the tension in the car thick and palpable. Cassy turned in her seat, her eyes locking onto Ethan's. He was staring at her, his expression a mix of fear, confusion, and something else, something that looked like hope. She reached for him, her hand resting gently on his arm. "We're going to be okay," she whispered, her voice filled with both determination and love. "We're together now. That's all that matters." Ethan didn't say anything, but he didn't pull away either. He just stared at her, his eyes searching her face, as if trying to piece together the fragments of a life he couldn't remember. And as they drove away from the farmhouse, the darkness of the night slowly giving way to the faint light of dawn, Cassy allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, They were finally on the path to finding their way back to each other. The drive through the darkened roads seemed endless, the car's headlights cutting through the mist that hung low over the asphalt. Inside the vehicle, silence filled the air, broken only by the soft hum of the engine and the occasional sound of Ryan shifting in the back seat. John kept his eyes on the road, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. Cassie turned in her seat, her eyes softening as she looked at Ryan, who sat beside Lily, his gaze distant, lost.
Ryan, Cassie spoke softly, the name still feeling foreign on her tongue even as she forced herself to use it.
Are you okay?
Her voice was filled with a mix of fear and love, every syllable carrying the weight of years of longing.
Ryan looked up, his eyes locking with hers for a brief moment before shifting away.
I don't understand any of this, he muttered, his voice barely audible.
Why did you take me? Who are you really?
His question was like a knife to Cassie's heart, each word cutting through her resolve. She took a deep breath, her heart aching as she tried to find the right words.
We're your parents, Ryan, she said, her voice trembling.
You were taken from us a long time ago, and we've been looking for you ever since.
She paused, her eyes searching his face, hoping for any sign of recognition. I know it's confusing, and I know you don't remember, but we love you. We've never stopped loving you. Ryan's eyes narrowed slightly, his expression hardening as he shook his head. I'm not Ethan, he said, his voice cracking. I'm Ryan. I have a family.
I don't know you.
John's heart clenched at his son's words, each one hitting him like a blow to the chest.
He kept his eyes on the road, his jaw clenched tightly as he fought to keep his emotions in check.
We're not here to hurt you, son, he said, his voice gruff.
We just want you to know the truth, to give you a choice.
Ryan stared at the back of John's head, confusion and fear warring in his eyes. He didn't respond, turning his gaze back to the window, watching the dark shapes of trees flash by. Cassie turned back around in her seat, tears welling in her eyes. She reached for John's hand, her fingers intertwining with his, seeking comfort in his touch. John squeezed her hand gently, his eyes never leaving the road.
Lily, who had remained silent throughout the drive, looked over at Ryan, her eyes filled with sympathy. They really are your parents, she said softly, her voice barely a whisper.
I've heard the people at the farmhouse talking.
They took you from them when you were little.
She paused, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. They've been looking for you for a long time. Ryan's eyes flickered, a mix of emotions passing across his face: confusion, fear, anger.
He turned away from her, his body tense as he tried to make sense of everything.
He wanted to deny it, to say that they were lying, but there was something in their eyes, something in the way they looked at him that made it hard to dismiss.
It was a love that was raw and real, a love that scared him.
The car finally pulled up to an old cabin, hidden deep within the woods, its silhouette barely visible in the early morning light. John turned off the engine, the sudden silence almost deafening. He looked at Cassie, his eyes tired but filled with determination.
We'll be safe here for a while, he said, his voice low. At least until we figure out what to do next.
Cassie nodded, turning to Ryan and Lily.
Come on, she said gently.
Let's get inside. She opened her door, stepping out into the cool air, the scent of pine and damp earth filling her senses. Ryan hesitated for a moment before following, his movements slow and uncertain. He looked around, his eyes taking in the unfamiliar surroundings, a sense of unease settling in his chest. John led them to the door, pushing it open with a creak. The cabin was small, with a worn sofa in the center of the room and a stone fireplace along one wall. It was simple, but it was safe, and that was all that mattered. Cassy guided Ryan to the sofa, her eyes never leaving his face. She could see the fear in his eyes, the confusion that clouded his gaze, and it broke her heart. She sat beside him, her hand resting gently on his arm.
"Ryan," she began, her voice soft.
"I know this is a lot to take in.
"I can't imagine how scared you must be, but I need you to know that we're here for you."
We're not going to force you into anything. We just want you to know who you are, where you come from." Ryan looked at her, his eyes filled with tears he refused to let fall.
"I don't remember," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I don't remember you. I don't remember any of this."
Cassy nodded,
her own eyes welling with tears.
"I know," she said, her voice breaking, "but that's okay.
We'll figure it out together. You don't have to remember everything right now.
Just know that we love you, and we're here." John, standing near the fireplace, cleared his throat, his eyes misty as he looked at his son. "We've waited 9 years for this moment, Ethan," he said, his voice rough with emotion. 9 years of searching, of hoping.
We're not giving up on you now." Ryan looked at John, something in his eyes softening.
He could see the pain etched on his father's face, the years of loss and longing that had left their mark. It was hard to process, hard to believe, but he could feel the sincerity in their words, the raw emotion that couldn't be faked. Lily, who had been standing by the door, stepped forward, her eyes on Ryan.
"They're telling the truth," she said softly.
"I've seen what those people are capable of. They lied to you, Ryan. They kept you from them. But now you have a chance to know the truth, to know who you really are."
Ryan looked down, his hands clenched in his lap.
He didn't know what to say, didn't know how to feel. Everything he thought he knew about himself was unraveling, and it terrified him. But as he looked up at Cassy, at John, he saw something he hadn't seen before, a glimmer of hope, a possibility of belonging, of finally understanding the emptiness that had always been there. "Can you show me?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper.
"Can you show me who I was?" Cassy's heart swelled, her eyes filling with tears as she nodded.
"Of course, sweetheart," she said, her voice trembling. She reached into her bag, pulling out a worn photograph, her hands shaking slightly as she handed it to him.
It was a picture of Ethan as a young boy, his face bright with a smile, his eyes filled with innocence and joy.
Ryan took the photograph, his eyes scanning the image.
He saw himself smaller, younger, happier.
He traced the outline of the scar beneath his left eye, the same scar he saw every day in the mirror, and something inside him shifted. It was a small flicker, a faint memory that he couldn't quite grasp, but it was there, and it was real. John moved closer, his voice gentle. "That's you, Ethan," he said. "That's the boy we remember, the boy we've been searching for."
Ryan looked up, his eyes meeting his father's.
For the first time, he allowed himself to believe, to consider the possibility that maybe, just maybe, they were telling the truth. He didn't remember everything, he didn't remember much at all, but he could feel something, a connection, a bond that went beyond memory.
Cassy reached for his hand, her fingers curling around his. "We'll take it one step at a time," she said softly.
"No pressure, no expectations, just us together." Ryan nodded, his heart heavy but hopeful.
He didn't know what the future held, didn't know if he would ever remember the life they spoke of, but for now, he was willing to try.
He was willing to take that first step towards something he had been missing for so long, toward a family, toward a home.
and as the first rays of morning sunlight filtered through the cabin windows, casting a warm glow across the room, Ryan allowed himself to lean into the possibility of a new beginning, a chance to discover the forgotten years and the love that had never let go. Filtered verb meaning: to pass through or spread slowly.
Example: the morning light filters through the worn curtains of the Miller household. Explanation: describes light or another substance moving through a barrier in a gradual way, often creating a softened effect.
Haunting adjective meaning: evoking strong emotions or memories, often in a disturbing way.
Example: his son's mischievous smile stared back at him, haunting him. Explanation: something that stays in your thoughts for a long time, often causing a sense of sadness or discomfort. Gruff adjective meaning: rough or stern in manner or voice. Example: John spoke, his voice gruff. Explanation: describes a voice or manner that is somewhat harsh or unfriendly. Withered adjective meaning: worn or altered in appearance due to long exposure to the elements or stress. Example: John sat with his face weathered by the years of searching. Explanation: indicates that something, like a face or a building, has aged or changed due to time and hardship.
Clenched verb meaning: to close tightly, especially because of an emotion like anger or determination.
Example: John's heart pounded, his fists clenched. Explanation: often used to describe closing a fist tightly or biting down due to strong emotions like fear or anger. Murmured verb meaning: to speak softly and indistinctly. Example: Cassy murmured, her voice barely audible. Explanation: speaking quietly, almost in a whisper, so that it's difficult for others to hear clearly.
Reluctantly adverb meaning: unwillingly or with hesitation.
Example: Cassy nodded reluctantly, fearing what was to come.
Explanation: describes doing something even though you don't really want to.
Unyielding adjective meaning: not giving way under pressure.
Determined or firm.
Example: John's gaze was filled with unyielding determination. Explanation: refers to someone who refuses to change their mind or to back down from a difficult situation. Did you enjoy the forgotten years and the story of John, Cassy, and Ethan?
Was it easy to follow along with the English, or did you find some parts challenging? Please let me know if there were words or phrases that were difficult to understand.
Remember, every story is a chance to learn more and grow, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this one. If you want to keep practicing your English comprehension, make sure to check out other stories on the channel.
In fact, there will be a suggested video appearing at the end of this one. Just click it to keep learning and improving.
Thanks for being here with me today, and I can't wait to see you in the next story.